So for the very first time, there was a sizable population inhabiting this deserted northeast corner, with its golden sands, rough seas, and colossal cliffs. A settlement which would grow into the town it is today, hosting near 20,000. I believe that many people could indeed tell you why this town is called the Bloo Toon, referencing blue mogginers, blue worsted moggins or stockings that the fishermen originally wore, though the population of Peterhead are most commonly known as Bloo Tooners nowadays. But what of Peterhead itself? What of its name? Well, the Norse invaders had arrived, set up camp, and were here to stay. Over the passage of time, eventually dissolving into the population itself. But I'm getting ahead. Think back to those Christian monks of Columba, sitting happily within their abbey of Deer, some 10 miles away. The last thing they wanted to risk was the propagation of foreign religion on their doorstep, and so could not sit idly by. Instead, they founded a Christian outpost, subordinate to the one at Deer, on a hill overlooking the sea and towards the Norse settlement, with its harbour of Almanithy. That hill some may remember as Windmill Brae, but nowadays is Balmore Terrace, one of the highest points in town, and indeed would be an impressive locale on which to build a beacon of faith. By the time of the first Norse invasions, the monks had already been established in Buchan for over 200 years, and over that time had mapped and marked the lands into distinct districts, of which seem to have retained their Celtic names, but at the same time would have added to them the name of a patron saint from their calendar, for example, St Fergus. The very first name applied to the immediate locale of Peterhead was Inner Yugi, or Inver Yugi, as previously mentioned, with its Gaelic roots describing the mouth of the river Yugi, mouth of the water. At that time, the district would have stretched to the north, as well as to the south of the Yugi, to include such parishes as St Fergus, Crimond, Longside, and Cruden, of which we will look at in further episodes. Afterwards, we can find records naming the town Inver Yugi St Peter. Naturally, such a long name could not long survive, for the tendency of language is to drop, not insert consonantal sounds, and therefore, not long after, we find it contracted to Peter Yugi. Thus, the name Inver Yugi is sadly shorn of its past importance, and now in more modern times only calls to memory of the small village further inland, the spot where the 2 ruined castles of Inverugie and Ravenscraig can be found. So it was to the Peter Yugi coast that came a swarm of monks intent on converting the Norsemen to Christianity through the instrumentality of the Celtic Church, of which Deer was the Buchan centre. With a truly Celtic love for colour and natural beauty, which distinguished Columba and his disciples, they settled on Windmill Brae, the most prominent and picturesque site for their holy abode, which can almost certainly assume was dedicated to St Peter. For, considering its position and the magnificent sea view it would have enjoyed, the name could never be more appropriate. For who could more suitably have been chosen as its protector than Peter, the patron saint of seamen, and him himself, one of that large class of men that go down to sea in ships. The Norsemen, being completely ignorant of Christianity, knew the settlement only as Monkesholm. Holm in the Scandinavian tongue meaning plain near river. So Monkesholm is the monks' plain near the river. The monks in their evangelistic efforts naturally wanted the Norse colony to be called after their church, to have at least something which might tie those fierce pagan warriors to Christianity. So they called it the town of St. Peter. Naturally, the Norsemen wished to know the meaning of this name. The fathers replied, "It means a stone, a rock, a firm foundation on which to build your faith, a cape or headland above the troubled sea. It is to us what Hofti is to you. Hofti also meaning headland in Norse. So Peter means Hofti. Peter Hofti. And in the slow progress of etymological evolution, it became known in time as Peterhead. So the settlement of Peterhead edged into existence, from Inverugi to Peterjugi, to Peterhofti, to Peterhead, to Peterhead. A settlement where Norsemen and Christianity slowly fused together, coexisting from 579 AD until this very day. There are other theories of the origin, of course. This one I have just explained seems to be the most plausible, and one I truly believe. The evidence surely points this way. However, the fishermen of Peterhead have their own little legends about the origin of the name. According to an old fisherman who died around 1890 at the age of 95, in the first harbour after the Almanithy was situated a small natural cove facing the South Bay, between Keithinch and the mainland. And here, the first citizen of Peterhead, a fisherman living about 1500 something, kept his small boat, with which he made monthly excursions to Aberdeen with his cured fish to barter for garden plants to stock his kail yard. A most singular commercial transaction. One day, when he was coming home from Aberdeen, a great storm arose, and his wife, with a kindly disposed neighbouring farmer, stood on the rocks gazing seaward. At last, to their relief, the farmer saw a small boat tacking slowly around the Buchaness. "Oh, Peter's come to his heed again," cried he. And so, ever afterwards, they called the Fisher's Cove Peterhead. Buchan, under Celtic rule, was a much larger district then, stretching from the River Don in the south well into Banffshire on the west, all under the rule of the Mormaer of Buchan, a title which was eventually dropped in exchange for the Saxon form Earl. On the death of Fergus, the last Mormaer, his only child Margaret, or Marjorie, became Countess of Buchan, the very first superior to assume the Saxon title. She married in 1210 to William Comyn, Sheriff of Forfar and Justiciary of Scotland, and soon after the wedding, William, now Earl of Buchan, made preparations for the erection of an abbey in his newly acquired estates. He wished to hasten the change from Celtic Christianity to Roman Christianity. A change at the time was taking place everywhere. He was displeased with the state of faith in Buchan, which had not made any progress since Columba and Drosten left the district. Since then, to 1218, the known history of the church at Peterhead is meagre. Monkesholm had played its part, but it was too far from the population, whom had mostly settled amongst the shores. Evidence of early settlement around the graveyard has been discovered at varying times. In the digging of graves, remains of human habitation revealed itself at varying depths. Rough pavements of undressed stones, sometimes with marks of fire on them, as if they'd been used for hearths, and occasionally charred wood and bones. The large quantity of shells of whelks, limpets, mussels and cockles found within the sandy soils of the links attested to the settlement by a community of people whom largely depended on the product of the sea for their food. A church does not foster population, but is fostered by it. So might this prehistoric church, the ruins of which still brave the elements within the churchyard, have been built for the fisher people by William Comyn, within a community sustained by the fresh waters of the Kirkburn, an asset the likes of the Almanithy and Keithinch could not yet supply, and with a sheltered bay, complete with beach, at which in almost any state of tide their coracles could launch and land without issue. The only parts which still remain today are the square tower and the gable at the west end, and an entire arch and part of the side walls at the east end. The Roman arch, the chancel, being the oldest part, some centuries older than the relatively modern church tower. Within the chancel itself, there are at least 3 graves marked by age-worn tombstones. The eastern one, alone, is perpendicular, although half sunk in the ground. Its fantastic scrolls and elaborately cut inscription may still be faintly traced, though not deciphered. The second tombstone is over the ashes of Bessie King, who died on the 8th of July, 1615. She came from the noble family of kings of Bertie and Barra, and her arms are sculptured on the stone. The remarkably perfect state of inscription and ornamentation is doubtless due to the close-grained, durable nature of the stone, which is locally known as sandstone liver rock. The third tombstone is a simple one, lying on the ground. It was originally erected to the Reverend James Walker, who was established church minister in Peterhead from 1739 to 1763, in which year he died. Sunk into the outside walls of the chancel, there are several imposing tombstones, none, however, of much importance except one at the south wall, erected to the memory of Reverend Robert Kilgour, Bishop of the Diocese of Aberdeen and Primus of the Scots Episcopal Church, who died in 1790. The bell tower remains. The earliest record of its existence is in the year 1679, when it was repaired. It is quite modern when compared to the chancel of the church. However, there must have been a tower, for the bell within was cast in 1647. The old bell, of Dutch make, still swings in the bell loft. It hangs from a time-worn axle tree and bears on it, its outer rim, the inscription Michael Verger Hoy, Meficit, 1647, Soli Deo Gloria. Its full, rich tone was said to be superior to the more powerful and harsher bells of the old parish church and the townhouse. It is a small bell, and one easily rung. The tower was in practical use long after the church at its base had become a heap of ruins, used as a watchtower for the resurrectionists, the relatives of the dead mounted guard over newly buried bodies, and many times at the dead of night had the frenzied clangour of the old bell wakened the inhabitants of the town to tell them that the grave openers and body snatchers were at their horrible work again. The church itself stood for around a century before it was extended, probably due to the rising population. However, during the year of 1770 it was eventually demolished, with materials being recycled in the building of the new church closer to the shore, just north of where the Kirkburn enters the sea, which in itself fell into disrepair. It was built in soft foundations, seated about 900 to 1200 people, but little else is known. It too was replaced by the Muckle Kirk, built in a time when ornamentation was thought superfluous and unnecessary. This in large explains the gaunt and sombre look of the building, for every Bloo Tooner is familiar with the clumsy barn-like appearance of this church, which, except for the spire, which stands 118 feet high in the style of Sir Christopher Wren, is without beauty of any kind. Though it is built in the Renaissance style, the words of its only poet could not commendate its grandeur. Massive building, minus beauty, tempest shielding does its duty. The church could accommodate a congregation of around 2,000, and today it serves its purpose as the starting point of the Peterhead Trail, a series of locations exploring the history of Peterhead, which we will tread along in part 3.